Well, now we are moving on to the exciting part of our meeting tonight, and we're lucky to have three individuals from the planning department with us. Nick Norris, of course, leads their planning department, and we also have Kelsey Lindquist, as well as Michael. And Michael, I'm sorry, I struggle with your name a little bit. I haven't heard it pronounced. You want to tell us how you say it?
Sure, it's McNamee, and I understand your struggle.
Okay, well, welcome to all of you. And I want to invite our audience to make sure that you, hold your questions to the end, but feel free to put them in the chat. Let these guys get through their presentation. We're excited that they have prepared this for us.
All right. So thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City. Tonight, we're going to cover a bunch of things that are mostly related to housing that we've been working on. And Councilmember Mono touched on some of these that the council adopted last week. But we were asked to give kind of an overview of what that means and some kind of basic details. And then we wanted to cover some things that are working their way to the council that have been through the planning commission, and then a couple other things that are in progress. So we will be kind of tag teaming this presentation because we've all had different roles on these different projects. And so when we get to each other's things, we'll let those people talk. But first, we want to talk about things that are approved by the council last week, so people know what they are. They're really, for us, there's the three big text changes that we refer to. One is shared housing. I'm going to go into more detail on each. We're going to go into more detail on these. So shared housing, some zoning changes to the RMF 30 zoning district, and then some off-street parking changes. And then Michael will talk about ADUs after we get through this. But I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey because she has a hard stop at 8, but I'll be able to answer any questions that come up after. So Kelsey, just let me know how you want to proceed with it.
Yeah. Would you like me to share the presentation, or would you like to, Nick? You probably should, maybe.
I have it. Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
Let me share that real quick. I have it up.
Yeah, and sorry about my hard stop. I thought it would be okay with the agenda, but I see that we have a short amount of time, so I'll be as brief as possible. So I was one of the project managers well, let me start over. My name is Kelsey Lindquist. I'm one of the planning managers with the planning division. And I was one of the project managers for RMF 30, which was just adopted last Tuesday. It was adopted with a delay in publication of the ordinance by 180 days. That means that these changes will not be effective for 6 months. And so that means that somebody could not come in if they owned an RMF 30 property and develop under these new regulations. We still are running under the current regs for RMF 30 for another 180 days. So the real goal of the RMF 30 amendments was to treat the RMF 30 like it was the purpose statement for the RMF 30, and for it to function truly like a lower scale multifamily district. What had been happening since it was adopted was primarily encouraging just single family development. So what we wanted to do was create that gentle density and infill with these changes. So we addressed the big barriers, which were the lot minimums. That includes square footage and then lot width as well. So we reduced both of those so that we could create additional units within the RMF 30. And then to address some of the public concerns for potential loss of naturally occurring affordable housing or historic structures, we introduced a unit density bonus. So how did we get there with these changes? We realized that 82% of all of the RMF 30 lots in the city were not actually eligible to have multifamily, meaning they didn't meet the lot minimums in our current RMF 30 regulations to construct a multifamily structure. The Salt Lake City ordinance determines multifamily as 3 or more units. And you'll see on this screen, our current regulations that are still in place required a minimum of 9,000 square feet of lot area for 3 units. It's quite significant. So what we did is we have reduced that to 2,000 for multifamily, single family duplexes, and then we proposed a new use for cottages and tiny homes at 1,500 square feet. Next slide. And then the lot widths were also a significant barrier. So in correlation with the minimum area of the 9,000 square feet or 5,000 for a single family, we also required 50 feet of lot frontage of width. We discovered that the majority of the RMF 30 lots actually didn't meet this requirement. And so we eliminated lot width minimums, and we introduced a lot width maximum to try to discourage land banking in these areas. Next slide. Oh, and then that's yours. So let me just touch really briefly on the density bonus for preservation of a structure. So in response to a lot of the community concerns of the loss of historic structures or maybe historic housing, which is oftentimes considered more affordable and attainable, we introduced a unit bonus if you keep that structure, that unit, and say you want to add an additional unit to your property, you would, and you're retaining the existing structure and unit, you would be eligible for a unit bonus. We have those ratios broken down by types and number of units already located on the property. And I believe it's going to hopefully be quite effective in retaining a lot of those structures that we wish to keep. So that's my part, and I'll turn it back over to Nick to talk about shared housing.
Thanks, Kelsey. Well, hang on. I can't get my presentation to really go backwards for some reason, but there we go. So shared housing was also adopted by the City Council last week. Let me briefly explain what this is. It's essentially just like many of us who ever lived in an apartment or rented a single family home with roommates. It's that exact same thing, only on a larger scale and bigger buildings. And so this is a type of use where in our case, there'll be a number of sleeping rooms that can share a kitchen and or a bath. So the regulations that were adopted by the council require 1 kitchen for every 4 sleeping rooms, and no more than 2 sleeping rooms can share 1 bath. So these are both market rate and affordable housing types. They're commonly and historically known as single room occupancy, although modern versions are much different than what they were in the past, to create a more, livable type of situation. But what this proposal did, it added some standards. You can see those on the screen, and I'm not going to read each one of those in the interest of time. But it expanded where in the city this use is allowed. This map shows all the different colors of the zoning districts where this use is now a permitted use. Well, once this ordinance is published, which should happen any day now. But I think the most significant thing is that prior to this being adopted, most of the land where this could be built was along the North Temple corridor or along Redwood Road. And hardly any of it was east of I-15. As you can see with the changes, we greatly expanded on the east of I-15 where this use could go, including downtown. I think it surprises many people that this was not an allowed use in most of our downtown and large zoning districts. So why do we do it? One, this is just one tool in our housing toolbox, but it removes a significant zoning barrier particularly for permanent supportive housing, which is a key to helping people transition out of homelessness. And we were really limited on where that could occur. And so this greatly expanded that to more parts of the city. It does increase housing choice. There are market rate shared housing apartment buildings, basically, that people have been building in other cities. We've had actually a couple people approach us about building them in Salt Lake, although that was pre COVID, and we don't know that necessarily this will be happening, but at the market rate level. But we know that we need to allow this type of housing in our city to help, particularly the lowest and deeply affordable housing options. I don't know that anybody will be able to type that link, but this is a link from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness that talks about this type of housing and how effective it is. It also provides some examples so people can look at it and learn how it's worked in other places. Another significant code change, this is probably the largest code change the city has done since we adopted our current zoning ordinance in 1995. But it was a complete rewrite of our off-street parking regulations. The goals for this, you can see them here, basically was to primarily align off-street parking requirements with access to other modes of travel. So transit, cycling, walking, etc. And fix some of the issues that our old parking ordinance has, just like similar to the RMF 30, this ordinance is a little bit different when it goes into effect. It goes into effect upon publishing, but for 4 months, people can, especially when they're in the development process, can choose to either use the prior parking regulations or this parking regulations. That is done primarily so people don't get caught up in a change in code when they have already started investing all their money in plans and everything else, but maybe they don't have full approvals yet. And so it has a built-in 4-month option for people to choose which one works to avoid those kinds of situations where the code changes and they're caught off guard by that. Again, big purpose of this was simplifying the regulations. We had a lot of issues and complications with our prior code. Some of you may have experienced this when projects have been presented to this community council. And, for example, for like a restaurant, there was such a low minimum requirement and the maximum was based off a percentage of that. Oftentimes new restaurants couldn't even provide parking for even half their staff on any shift. And so that was a big focus, was trying to correct some of those errors in our code. And also, like I said, align it primarily with transit. So one of the big things is that the areas in red on this map, some of these already did not have a minimum parking requirement, but we expanded the areas that new development, changes of use, when a restaurant's built or a retail store, an office building, if they basically now in these red zones do not require any minimum off-street parking. There are certain housing types that have been built in the city in zones that didn't require minimum that have built none. Most still build parking, however. And then the areas in green are areas where the minimum has been lowered. The blue areas also have some minor changes. You'll see the 9th and 9th business district there. Most of those changes were actually to the maximums, like I said, and so increasing those so that there's more flexibility and we aren't unnecessarily limiting some really great businesses from being located in our neighborhoods where we want them, especially when they're local. So it also includes some reductions for affordable and senior housing for those uses that the occupants tend not to use or have cars. Like I said, no minimum does not mean no parking will be provided. And almost every instance in the city where no minimum has been required for at least 10 years now, we've only had maybe 4 or 5 projects. Most of those are housing projects in the Central Ninth neighborhood that are lower scale, 4 stories that have not provided parking. So they are required to provide ADA accessible parking, but otherwise they haven't. So this allows some flexibility for people to, if they to choose where, if they want a car or not, and to choose housing where they don't need to necessarily pay for parking. Next up, we're going to talk about ADUs. And I'm going to let Michael, who was the project manager on this, give a quick overview of those changes.
Thanks, Nick. So my name is Michael McNamee. I'm a principal planner with the planning division. And like Nick said, I've been the project manager for the city's proposed changes to the ADU ordinance. So just to give you some background, the current ADU ordinance, and ADU is short for accessory dwelling unit. The current ordinance was passed in 2018. And since that time, the production of ADUs has sort of underperformed the city's expectations. And so recognizing that ADUs are an important addition to a diverse housing stock, the city is taking this opportunity to propose some changes that would hopefully strike a better balance between making it easier to build ADUs and still mitigating potential impacts on neighboring properties. So to just give you sort of the high level view of what the big changes are. So right now, detached ADUs, which are the small apartments that are built in separate buildings, either in a standalone building or generally above like a garage in someone's backyard. If you're in a single family residential zoning district, those require what's called a conditional use, which is essentially an extra layer of approval where you have to go to the planning commission and they'll take a vote on whether or not to approve it. We are proposing to eliminate that. The state legislature passed a law last year that made attached ADUs, so the mother-in-law apartments, basement apartments, permitted. And so it's just those detached ADUs require that conditional use now. And so that was identified as a significant barrier to ADU construction. Another change is allowing ADUs in more than just residential districts. So in any zone in the city that already allows other types of residential, we're proposing to also allow ADUs. And then as part of that, also expanding the type of principal use that an ADU can be attached to. So right now it has to be a single family home. We're proposing to expand that so you can build an ADU on a property that has a duplex or multifamily use or a commercial use. We're also proposing to make some adjustments to the development standards for ADUs, increasing the maximum allowable size. So that was actually changed by the Planning Commission when this went to a hearing last month. So they proposed that we increase that allowable size to 1,000 square feet to accommodate for more family-sized units, to help provide that more affordable option for families. So that maximum is proposed to be 1,000 square feet. If you're in a residential zone and your lot is smaller than 12,000 square feet, for other lots, it would be 1,200 square feet would be the allowable maximum. And then we're also carrying over a requirement or an allowance for parking not to be provided if the ADU is close to transit or if there's on-street parking available in front of the property. Also making some other changes just to make the ordinance easier to understand for the public and for staff. So to give you an update on the process, like I mentioned, this was brought to the Planning Commission for a vote in September at their September 14th hearing, and they voted to forward a positive recommendation to the City Council with the condition that we increase the allowable maximum size. And so we are in the process of transmitting those proposed changes to the city council. Once that happens, the city council will decide when they want to hear it and vote on whether or not to make those changes.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Next up, we're going to talk about some of the other things that are upcoming. So one, I know Kelsey's still here, but Kelsey was supposed to leave. So I'm gonna make her leave so she can go have a personal life, live her life. And I'm going to cover this. This was one of Kelsey's projects, but this was basically a proposal to address and update downtown building heights. The primary reason for this was to align our zoning requirements for height in the downtown area to match the construction types in building codes. And so we carried over a lot of different things, but we also made some adjustments. For those that don't know, in the central business district, there actually is no maximum height that was carried over, but there are two in the current code. There were two thresholds where it required design review to address the impacts of height. Those were consolidated into only one, so that corner lots and mid-block lots are treated the same. In some other zones, like around the intermodal hub in Salt Lake Central Station, we increased the building heights up to 180 feet in that area. And then in some of the edges of downtown, particularly west of 200 East, there were also some changes. But we did this as well with some caveats. So buildings over a certain height either have to include one of four things. They either have to include affordable housing as part of that, a mid-block walkway, which really helps address our connectivity downtown and makes our downtown more livable. Many of these mid-block walkways also, as you can see in this picture of a building under construction, also become fire access roads, which, as we learned and witnessed a couple of days ago, are really important for big, tall buildings. And so those are required anyway. And so we felt like, well, if we can get those to be also served in mid-block walkways, then it's a win-win for people. Or they can include publicly accessible outdoor space, or 100% of the ground floor of their building at the street being commercial. So we have a number of other things that are going to be next up at the Planning Commission. Some are already in progress. And I noticed on the agenda that Jason was going to talk about the Homeless Resource Center related zoning code. So I have some slides on that at the end if we need them, but I'm not going to talk about that until Jason does. And if he needs any help from us, then we'll participate. But I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple other big things that are in various stages. The first are the affordable housing incentives. Some of you may know that this is something that went to the Planning Commission earlier this year. There's a lot of public interest in this proposal. There were a number of concerns and issues raised, and since that time, we've been working on trying to address those and trying to figure that out. But the biggest thing that this does is that it provides density bonuses for projects that include affordable housing. Those density bonuses are either in allowing more units, some cases where we don't have density limitations like minimum lot areas per unit. It allows additional building height. And it also shortens the approval process, which is one of the things that we've heard and experienced with affordable housing, is that the longer it takes, the harder it is for those projects to verify and get approval for their various funding sources. And so shortening that is really critical for those projects coming online. As an example of this, we've already had one affordable housing project that went through an approval process with the Planning Commission last year that was canceled because it missed the deadlines to get their funding source, and they couldn't find alternative funding sources. And so we're looking at shortening that. We currently are working with a focus group that's made up of housing advocates, community members, developers, people who were opposed to the project, and some other neighborhood groups that we set up. We do have a manageable working group. Not everybody who wanted to be on it is on it, but the whole point of this group is to help potentially find some different solutions to the four main themes of issues. So those were lowering the level of affordability. The code said 80%. We're trying to get that down under 60% of AMI. And for those that don't know, that's the qualifying income to be these units, and still have the incentives be effective. The other is neighborhood impacts. So how this proposal may impact those neighborhoods, and working through some of those standards that we could add or modify to help address that. Enforcement of this, which is a huge thing, which we've known all along. And we're working with, and I've met with various cities around the country to try to figure out how they enforce similar provisions to make sure that we can do it as effectively as possible. And then the other is making sure that utilities in the city can handle the density, which we are certain it can. We want to put together the numbers so that we can demonstrate that. The other three big things that are at the staff level, we don't even have drafts of these yet, is implementing the ballpark station area plan that Councilmember Mono just mentioned being adopted, by updating the zoning around that station. This is actually something that is now kind of a requirement under state code. For track stations, we're basically supposed to have a station area plan and the associated zoning adopted around every track station that we have in the city. It also includes bus rapid transit, but we don't have any bus rapid transit in the city right now. So, but we have close to 50% of all the track stations. Fortunately, most of our stations already have a station area plan and have zoning already aligned along North Temple and 400 South. And the state code allows us cities to request exemptions from that, which we will be submitting for stations that are, for example, at the airport where we can't build housing, and on the university stations on the university campus where we don't control what's built. So just a heads up on those kinds of things that you're going to start seeing. We just are kicking off a analysis of the current general plan and zoning regulations for the 300 West corridor with a consultant that we got a transportation land use connection grant for. That'll be about a 12-month process to get that code to the point where it can go through the adoption process. But the intent of that is, we know the 300 West corridor is changing. The city has invested a ton of money in the ongoing rebuild of that street and adding particularly the protected bike lanes. And so we know it's a changing corridor, and we want to get the zoning and plan in place to help support that. And then several years ago, many of you probably might remember a project called Life on State. For various reasons, that plan never was adopted. We are going to hopefully in this next calendar year reinvigorate that plan and get it adopted along with some zoning changes along the State Street corridor, which requires kind of a surgical approach to do it because of how close in proximity some of our older, smaller scale neighborhoods are directly east of State, and then also west and in between State and Maine. So you can look forward to those types of things. And with that, I'm going to end so that Jason can talk about the Homeless Resource Center. And if there's questions, we have a few minutes. I think we can answer some questions.
I think you're muted, Christina.
Sorry. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that were sort of, asked to us before the meeting, Nick.
Okay.
And of course, they're going to be about parking because, as we all know, parking is sticky subject. So let's see. I guess we'd like to kind of know how parking is going to affect 9th and 9th. Especially the new development there. For example, what would change now? Like somebody came in with a 2,000 square foot restaurant. What would it what would it be like now and what would it be like after the parking change?
Yeah. So the biggest thing in areas like 9th and 9th is that the old code had a number of ways where people could reduce their minimum parking requirement down almost to zero. And while that is good in many places, it also creates some very unique challenges when we have business districts very close to homes and things like that. And, we know that parking has always been a concern in the, particularly in the 9th and 9th area. There's other places where we have really popular restaurants that experience that same type of thing. And so what this proposal does is it still allows some reductions for certain types of things, like I said, with the affordable housing, but it limits the scope of those reductions. It also doesn't require a minimum parking for commercial uses on small lots. And so that is something that we wanted to retain so that we weren't seeing some of our buildings that provide great opportunities, particularly for small local businesses to be located in, from not being able to change a use, whether it, maybe it used to be like a small little retail store and somebody wants to add a little coffee shop to it. Well, under our old code, you'd have to add parking for that. And so a lot of those places just never changed, or they sat vacant. And so that was part of the goal. But I mentioned earlier that the parking maximums actually increased in neighborhood business districts like 9th and 9th. And that was because we did have some places that wanted to open up, but they needed and this isn't a lot, but they maybe needed 5 parking stalls, and they could only get 2 under our old code because of the size of their space. And so that was seen as an economic development concern and issue. So the takeaway is the elimination of the ways to reduce it, including being able to count the on-street spaces. You can't do that anymore. And then increasing the maximum.
Interesting. Okay, so we really appreciate the planning department being here with us tonight. And just speaking from ELPCO before we take any more questions, we are excited to use your presentation here in order to train our new board members and to make sure that people that we work with have this background, and our neighbors are able to, refer back to this presentation. And we think that it will, simplify, sort of provide a tutorial for people to get the basics before they get too worried, and I really appreciate you outlining everything so simply and concisely for us. And
we, Christina, we also do a planning zoning 101 for community councils. We're happy to come back at any time and provide that.
That's fantastic. I was kind of thinking after listening to you tonight that it will behoove us to talk to many of our neighbors, maybe go to door and see what people, have to say, and then ask them more thoughtful questions at some point down the road. So that can, and then bring you back for that 101. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anyone from the group have questions?
I have a question. I just had a question about the ADU limit. So you said that 9,000 square foot lot can be a multifamily. It can have shared, like shared living, like multiple units, single family in one, with one kitchen shared and stuff like that. And that's going to change to 2,000. Did I hear all that?
No, I think you might be mixing 2 different proposals.
Okay.
The shared housing is a different thing than an ADU. An ADU is basically like a backyard cottage or basement apartment or apartment over garage, something like that. And those you can have 1 per property. And then, like Michael said, there's under the recommendation the Planning Commission made that the City Council will consider is that maximum size can be up to 1,000 square feet. It can go up to 1,200 square feet if your property is more than 12,000 square feet. Is that right, Michael? So two different things there. There's still lot coverage requirements that you'd have to comply with. So not everyone's going to be able to have 1,000 square foot ADU.
What was the multifamily part of that then?
That was the shared housing proposal. So that's a different type of living. It's more similar to multifamily. It's not allowed in the, it's only allowed in our mixed use zoning districts. So along tracks, downtown, in our commercial districts, things like that. It's not allowed in our residential zones.
So that's when I go to like Europe and I get, my wife and I get a Airbnb or something, and we rent it for a couple nights, but we got to go, use the kitchen with 5 other guests, and there's 2 bathrooms to share between everybody, all the rooms.
It's similar to that.
Okay.
But it's more of a longer term housing situation.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Again, thank you. I really appreciate everyone being here. So I think we'll turn the time over to Jason now to speak to the HRC overlay. Jason, are you ready?
I am, although it's a little bit silly. I feel like I'm giving a book report with the author in the audience, because
Yeah.
the folks who wrote this overlay are sitting right there. They're probably going to be noting down all the mistakes I make. But appreciate it, Nick, if you would chime in if I make a major blunder. ELPCO was invited along with other community councils to several stakeholder meetings where we learned about this process. Traditionally, homeless resource centers have been cited only in very narrow bands due to the previous zoning. Really along like in Ballpark, and then a place way over in the far west of the city. Those are the only places that homeless resource centers could be. That's where they are right now, the 2 that are in Salt Lake City, as well as some other facilities related to them. So what's going on is that Salt Lake City is going to be changing the way that zoning approaches homeless resource centers, or even how homeless resource centers approach zoning. So instead of saying it can go here and it can't go there, what the planning department is proposing is what's called a zoning map overlay, which would allow basically takes away those restrictions of you can only be in specific zones, and it can be anywhere in the city, but it has to meet a lot of strict criteria in terms of its impact on the community, on police and fire resources, other public services, proximity to other homeless resource centers or other services that provide services to those that are homeless. And so it's a totally different approach. And this all came about because of a moratorium that has been in place in Salt Lake since about October 2021, basically giving the city some time to come up with a new plan. And that's what this new plan is. I will be putting some of that info in the chat. But one of the confusing concepts of this, of what exactly is a kind of a zoning map overlay or an overlay, and it basically means that you have your zoning, and then you basically apply another set of criteria on top of your traditional zoning, and then you see whether it fits or not. That's kind of the basic way to explain it. The one thing I will say that is also different is that traditionally homeless resource centers have been cited with through a conditional use process, which we're familiar with ADUs and a lot of other projects that come into our neighborhoods. This will change that so that it will no longer be a conditional use, but it will have to go through the Salt Lake City Planning Commission, and then newly it will have to go through the City Council. And that's an important determination here, is that it's actually going to go to elected officials to make the final determination about yes or no about whether or not this homeless resource center could be cited, which kind of adds a whole other dynamic to the approval process, puts it a little bit more into the political realm as well. So I will put up a little bit of info about that, including some links. But I think the major takeaways are that we are moving from if this passes and is approved without major changes, we're moving from a situation where homeless resource centers could be cited only in a narrow band of approved zoning districts to where they can be cited anywhere in the city, because it's a map that can apply, it's a zoning amendment that can be applied anywhere, but they have to meet some stricter criteria, the existing criteria as well as some newer criteria about whether or not they should be there. And the final decision comes down to the Salt Lake City Council. Nick, how would you grade me on that? I get maybe a B?
You did great.
Do you have anything to add, Nick?
I don't. The only, well, maybe I do. Not about anything that Jason said, but maybe about some of the upcoming things that we have going on associated with that. Given the tight time frame that the council put on us, so basically we have to have something transmitted to the council by January 31st. Otherwise, that former conditional use process kicks back in. So we have a number of engagement opportunities for people to participate that are coming up. One on November 1st, we're going to do a Facebook Live event, and all of these are going to be recorded with the videos posted on our project website, so people can watch these at any time and provide feedback. We'll also have an in-person open house on November 10th at the Public Safety Building. So more details of that are on the website, on our website at slcgov/planning. And then we're going to have a Planning Commission briefing on November 12th, where we're introducing this to the Planning Commission for the first time. And those are all good opportunities for people to learn about the proposal. And then we'll have a Planning Commission public hearing in December. And all those dates and information and ability to find out more and leave direct comments on this proposal are all on our access from our website.
Gotcha. And I did put up some of those links in the chat there. So about some of those upcoming events. And sorry, we had a little bit of a Zoom bomber. So we got rid of him though. So sorry if that was a little disruptive. We've actually had people trying to get into this meeting since we started. So we're popular.
Okay, well, I think that is the end of our planning section, unless we have any further questions from the people who are joining us. I don't see anything in the chat. But again, thank you, Nick and Michael, for joining us. I think that was very helpful.